In the long and dark history of America, few names send shivers down the spine like Ted Bundy. More than 30 young women, daughters, sisters, friends never came home. 30 confirmed victims, but many believe the number was higher, lost in the silence of unmarked graves and nameless forests. His crimes stretched across multiple states, leaving behind an investigation that cost the government millions of dollars and consumed the lives of countless detectives. To understand the magnitude, picture the 1970s, a time before the internet, before DNA databases, when communication between state police was agonizingly slow. In that world, Bundy thrived. He killed, disappeared, and moved on. What made him terrifying wasn't only the body count, but the mask he wore. A mask of intelligence, politeness, and charm. He was not the shadowy figure lurking in an alley. He was the man who held doors open, who smiled in photographs, who shook hands at political events. Evil, dressed in a suit and tie. The numbers are chilling. 30 victims, 7 states. Over a decade of deception, more than $2 million poured into trials, appeals, and investigations. Hundreds of law enforcement officers involved. And in the end, an electric chair in Florida waiting for him. Yet, even as sparks of justice finally silenced him, the echo of Bundy's crimes remained. A question that has haunted America ever since. How did no one see the monster hiding in plain sight? And that is what we are here to unravel. This is not merely a retelling of murders. This is a journey into the dark theater of manipulation, violence, and deceit, a theater directed by a man whose true face terrified the world once it was finally revealed. But before we begin, if you are watching this, you are someone who dares to stare into the abyss of history. This channel is not for the faint of heart. It is for those who choose to confront the darkness, to understand the monsters that walked among us. So, if you haven't yet, subscribe now, because what follows is not just a story, it is a confrontation with fear itself. When people first heard the name Ted Bundy, they didn't think of a murderer. They thought of a clean-cut, articulate, and handsome young man with an easy smile. He blended into the crowds of 1970s America, like a familiar face you might pass in the supermarket or at a university campus. Bundy was studying law, volunteering in political campaigns, and even working at a suicide hotline, ironically, saving lives while secretly taking them away. That contradiction is what made him so terrifying. He didn't look like the villain in a horror film. There was no scar across his cheek, no wild eyes, no shadowed trench coat. Instead, there was a man who wore khaki pants, combed his hair neatly, and knew how to hold a conversation that made people feel comfortable. He had girlfriends, friends, even colleagues who respected him. To them, he was witty, intelligent, ambitious. If evil had a face, it was supposed to look ugly. Ted Bundy proved the opposite. The people closest to him, especially his long-term girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer, noticed cracks. Bundy could be cold, distant, and oddly secretive. But like many abusive relationships, charm and manipulation blurred the lines. Elizabeth would later admit that she suspected him, but guilt and love held her back. She was torn between what her heart wanted to believe and the disturbing coincidences stacking up around him. Bundy's ability to present himself as normal was his sharpest weapon. He understood how people judged appearances. He knew that in America, a man in a nice shirt with a good vocabulary could walk anywhere, talk to anyone, and gain trust. That trust became his camouflage. Behind his politeness, he carried ropes, crowbars, and a hunger for control. The most chilling part. Bundy didn't just kill. He staged elaborate performances. He often pretended to be injured, using slings or crutches, to lure women into helping him. He relied on their kindness, their instinct to care. And once they were close enough, once they leaned into his world, there was no escape. Before the world knew his name, Ted Bundy was already perfecting the role of the harmless stranger. And it worked until young women began disappearing, vanishing into the shadows of his lies. America had no idea that its perfect stranger was about to unleash a nightmare, unlike anything it had seen before. It began quietly, almost invisibly, like whispers carried on the night wind. In early 1974, young women in the Pacific Northwest started disappearing. First it was Linda Ann Healy, a University of Washington student, who vanished from her own bedroom. Her neatly made bed was smeared with blood, her nightgown gone, her belongings untouched. No signs of forced entry. No sound heard by her roommates. One moment she was there, the next she had slipped into a void. Then it happened again, and again. Donna Manson, Susan Reincourt, Roberta Parks, all young, all bright, all vanishing into thin air. Police files grew thicker, but answers remained empty. The girls seemed to share a haunting pattern. Attractive, college-aged, long hair often parted down the middle. They were the daughters of the 1970s, living in an age of newfound freedom, but walking unknowingly into a trap set by a predator. What puzzled investigators was how ordinary the circumstances appeared. Witnesses reported a polite young man, sometimes on crutches, sometimes with his arm in a sling, asking for help loading books or carrying something to his Volkswagen Beetle. They remembered his smile, his soft-spoken manner. They remembered his name, Ted. At first, it seemed impossible. Who would commit violent acts in broad daylight, in the middle of bustling college campuses, where hundreds of students walk by every hour? But that was the brilliance of Bundy's disguise. He understood that people rarely question kindness. When he asked for help, women wanted to believe he was harmless. They wanted to believe the world was safe. And by trusting him, they walked willingly into his hands. As the weeks passed, fear began to seep into the cities of Washington and Oregon. Posters of missing women lined telephone poles. Parents warned their daughters to never walk alone. Police formed task forces, but could not pin down a suspect. The only thing they had was a first name, Ted, a vague description of a man who could just as easily be any student, any neighbor, any passerby on the street. It was the beginning of something darker, something far beyond a series of disappearances. The first stains of blood had appeared, invisible to most, but undeniable to those who were watching closely. A predator was circling, and the Pacific Northwest was about to descend into terror. By the summer of 1974, the Pacific Northwest was gripped by fear. The missing women weren't just isolated cases anymore, they were a pattern. Newspapers carried the faces of college students side by side like a grim mosaic. Linda, Donna, Roberta, Susan. Each photograph a reminder of a young life interrupted, each smile frozen in time. Police, overwhelmed and desperate, began to realize they weren't dealing with ordinary disappearances. Something systematic, deliberate, and horrifying was unfolding. But the problem was bigger than the crimes themselves. In that era, communication between police departments was painfully slow. A disappearance in Oregon might not be linked to one in Washington until weeks later. And Bundy thrived in that gap, slipping across state lines, carrying his secrets with him. The task forces were drowning in leads, and yet, none seemed to point anywhere concrete. Witnesses described a man named Ted with a Volkswagen Beetle. But how many Volkswagens were there on the roads of America? Thousands. How many young men named Ted? Thousands. More. Each clue became a dead end, and the fear only deepened. Bundy's method was deceptively simple, and it worked. He played on trust, on the instinct to help. He wore slings or plaster casts, feigning weakness. To the women who saw him, he wasn't a predator, he was a man in need. That brief moment of empathy sealed their fate. Once inside his car, once under his control, there was no way back. The public started to panic. College campuses, once alive with laughter and music, were now shrouded in suspicion. Young women clutched pepper spray, refused to walk alone, and second-guessed every stranger who asked for help. Parents begged their daughters to come home. A generation was learning a cruel truth. Danger did not always look like danger. Sometimes, it smiled politely and said, "Excuse me, could you help me with this?" And while police scrambled, Ted Bundy stayed one step ahead. He wasn't lurking in dark alleys. He was in plain sight, walking among the crowds, laughing with friends, even attending classes. His greatest weapon wasn't the crowbar or the rope, it was invisibility. The power to be overlooked, underestimated, and ignored. The hunt had begun. But the hunters didn't yet realize they were chasing a man who understood their every blind spot. And Bundy, intoxicated by his ability to outwit them, was just getting started. On July 14, 1974, a warm Sunday afternoon, the beaches of Lake Sammamish State Park were crowded with thousands of families, students, and young couples enjoying the sun. Children played in the water, radios hummed with rock music, and picnic blankets stretched across the grass. It was the picture of carefree summer. But that day would shatter the illusion of safety for good. Amid the laughter and chatter, a man walked through the crowds. He was tanned, handsome, neatly dressed. His left arm was in a sling, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who belonged. He approached women, one after another, introducing himself as Ted. His request seemed harmless. Could they help him load a sailboat onto his car? Most women politely declined, some feeling uneasy. But Janice Otiti, a 23-year-old probation caseworker, agreed to help. Witnesses saw her leave with the man toward the parking lot, where a Volkswagen Beetle awaited, not a sailboat. She never returned. Hours later, the same man, still calm, still charming, struck again. He introduced himself to Denise Nasland, a 19-year-old student, and used the exact same trick. She, too, disappeared without a trace. 2 women, in broad daylight, taken from a park full of people. The audacity was staggering. Witnesses remembered him clearly. His name, his car, even his appearance. For the first time, police had something more than fragments. They had a suspected, driving a Volkswagen. But Bundy's confidence was not unfounded. Even with dozens of eyewitnesses, the case quickly became a tangle. Police received hundreds of tips, and the name Ted was maddeningly common. Lists of suspects swelled into the thousands, and among them, buried in the paperwork, was Theodore Bundy, a law student, political volunteer, and all-around normal guy. He was noted, but not pursued. He simply didn't look like a killer. For the families of Janice and Denise, the days turned into weeks of agonizing silence. Search teams scoured the forests, but the woods swallowed their secrets. It wasn't until months later that hikers stumbled upon skeletal remains in the mountains east of Seattle. The grim discovery confirmed the worst. Bundy had struck again, and his cruelty was escalating. The Lake Sammamish abductions changed everything. They exposed the sheer boldness of the predator, and they forced the public to confront a horrifying truth. No place was safe, not even a crowded beach in broad daylight. Ted Bundy had turned an idyllic summer afternoon into a nightmare etched forever into America's memory. While investigators were chasing shadows, Ted Bundy was slipping comfortably into a double life. To the outside world, he was ambitious, charming, and even respectable. He dated, he studied law, he volunteered at political campaigns. He knew how to shake hands, how to smile at the right time, how to appear as the perfect young man with a bright future. Friends described him as witty and intelligent, sometimes moody, but never dangerous. To them, he was simply Ted. At the heart of this carefully built facade was Elizabeth Klopfer, Bundy's longtime girlfriend. Elizabeth, a single mother, loved him deeply. He spent nights at her house, played with her daughter, and shared in her dreams of building a family. 2 neighbors, they seemed like a normal couple. But behind closed doors, Elizabeth saw flickers of darkness. There were nights when Bundy vanished without explanation. Nights when she woke to find strange items, rope plaster, crutches hidden in his things. There were times she noticed her money missing, times when his lies didn't add up. Fear gnawed at her. More than once, she called the police to report her suspicions. She even gave them his name, Ted Bundy. But each time, her doubts were swallowed by his charm. Bundy had a way of pulling her back in, reassuring her, twisting her guilt. "How could you think that of me?" he'd say. And Elizabeth, torn between intuition and love, would let herself believe him. This was Bundy's genius. He didn't just deceive strangers, he deceived the people closest to him. His friends, his professors, even his political colleagues trusted him. At one point, he worked at a Seattle crisis hotline, answering late-night calls from desperate people. He saved lives with calm words, offering compassion and guidance, all while harboring the secrets of the women he had already killed. That contradiction was chilling. The man who took lives by night and pretended to save them by day. It was as if Bundy enjoyed the performance, the thrill of knowing he could stand in the light, while his crimes rotted in the dark. But the walls of his double life were slowly closing in. Witnesses had seen Ted with a Volkswagen at Lake Sammamish. Elizabeth had whispered his name to detectives. His mask was cracking but not yet breaking. For now, he was still the killer next door, smiling at neighbors while planning his next move. And the next move would plunge America even deeper into fear. By late 1974, the horror was no longer confined to Washington or Oregon. Ted Bundy's shadow stretched across the American West, leaving behind a trail of vanished women and haunted towns. Each case mirrored the last. A young woman, often a college student, attractive, intelligent, with long parted hair, and then, silence. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Bundy had expanded his hunting grounds. He struck in Utah, Idaho, and Colorado, crossing state lines as easily as one might cross a street. In Utah, Carol Duranch survived his attack and became a rare voice of the living, describing how a man pretending to be a police officer tried to abduct her. Her escape was a miracle, but it also gave investigators their first solid lead. A detailed description of the predator. Bodies began to appear in ravines, mountains, and forests scattered like grim signatures of his passage. Some were so badly decomposed that only bones remained, gnawed by time and wilderness. Forensic science in the 1970s was primitive compared to today. There was no DNA testing, no digital databases. Identifying remains relied on dental records, clothing fragments, or chance. Families waited in agony for months, sometimes years, before learning the fate of their daughters. The public's fear reached a fever pitch. Newspapers ran headlines warning women not to walk alone. College campuses instituted strict curfews. Students whispered stories about a man in a beetle, about a stranger with a sling, about the phantom who smiled before he killed. The word serial killer was not yet common, but Bundy's pattern was forcing America to recognize the concept. Meanwhile, Bundy thrived on the chaos. His confidence grew with every successful deception, every failed attempt by police to catch him. He moved effortlessly between his two identities, the ambitious law student by day, the remorseless hunter by night. Two friends. He was still Ted, the same man who cracked jokes, attended parties, and talked about a future in politics. To his victims, he was the last face they would ever see. The nation trembled because Bundy proved a terrifying truth. Evil didn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it stood beside you in the grocery line, or held your hand at a campaign rally. Sometimes it drove a Volkswagen Beetle and introduced itself with a smile. And as the number of victims climbed, one question echoed in the minds of terrified Americans. How do you catch a man who looks just like everyone else? For nearly a year, Bundy evaded capture with unnerving ease. But in August 1975, his arrogance finally caught up with him. Late at night in Utah, a patrol officer noticed a suspicious Volkswagen Beetle creeping through a residential neighborhood. Inside was Theodore Bundy. When the officer pulled him over, what he found was not the car of a law student, it was the toolkit of a predator, a ski mask, a crowbar, rope, handcuffs, trash bags, gloves, all neatly tucked into the Beetle. It was a chilling collection. The kind of items that seemed designed not for protection but for control and disposal. The officer didn't yet know the scale of Bundy's crimes, but he knew something was very, very wrong. Bundy was arrested. For investigators, it was their first real victory. Witnesses like Carol Duranch, who had narrowly escaped his clutches, identified him as the man who had tried to abduct her. The evidence was mounting. At last, the predator had a face, a name, and a prison cell. But if anyone thought this was the end, they underestimated the man entirely. Bundy thrived on manipulation, and jail was just another stage for his performance. He studied law books, advised his own defense, and charmed journalists with his intelligence. He wanted the world to see him not as a criminal, but as a misunderstood man, an innocent, wrongly accused. To some, disturbingly, it worked. His confidence bordered on arrogance. In 1977, Bundy represented himself in court, and during a library visit, he spotted a second-story window. The guards were distracted, and in a moment that seemed ripped from fiction, Bundy jumped. He landed, limped away, and vanished into the mountains. For 6 days, he roamed free before being caught again. The world watched in disbelief. How could one of America's most dangerous men simply leap out a courthouse window? The incident was humiliating for authorities, but it was only a prelude, because Bundy wasn't finished. In December of that same year, he escaped again, this time from a Colorado jail, sawing a hole in the ceiling and climbing into freedom. For law enforcement, it was a nightmare. Bundy wasn't just a killer. He was a master manipulator, a man who used his intelligence as a weapon, as sharp as any knife. And as he slipped once more into the night, nobody knew where he would strike next. What followed would be one of the darkest chapters in American crime history. Bundy's second escape in December 1977 was no temporary taste of freedom. It was liberation for a predator who had grown bolder with every success. After wriggling his way through the ceiling of his Colorado jail cell, he vanished into the snowy night, leaving guards humiliated and investigators scrambling. This time, he didn't just want to run. He wanted to kill again. He traveled south, eventually reaching Florida, a place as far as he could imagine from the mountains and forests where his crimes had begun. It was January 1978, and the state was alive with college life, beaches, and late-night parties. Bundy blended in effortlessly, a stranger among strangers, but the hunger that had driven him for years returned, darker than before, and now unchained by the fear of being caught. On the night of January 15, 1978, Bundy slipped into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What happened inside was one of the most brutal attacks in American history. moving silently from room to room. He bludgeoned and strangled 4 women in their sleep. 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, were murdered. 2 others were savagely beaten but survived. Within minutes, Bundy had turned a house filled with laughter, posters, and textbooks into a chamber of horror. But he wasn't finished. Just blocks away, later that same night, Bundy attacked another student, Cheryl Thomas, leaving her permanently disabled. His rampage was uncontrolled, frenzied, as if years of hidden violence had erupted in one explosive storm. The nation woke up to headlines that read like a nightmare. Sorority house, slaughter. The attacks shocked America not only for their brutality, but for their recklessness. Bundy no longer cared about hiding. He wasn't luring women with charm or pretense. He was smashing through locked doors, leaving survivors, daring the world to catch him. His mask of control had slipped, revealing something raw and animalistic beneath. For weeks, panic gripped Florida. Students slept in groups, barricaded their dorms, and carried weapons to class. Police flooded campuses, determined not to let the phantom escape again. And finally, on February 15, 1978, Bundy's luck ran out. He was pulled over by a Pensacola police officer. Inside the stolen car he drove, officers found stolen IDs and suspicious items. When pressed for his name, he smirked and refused. Finally, he spat out 2 words. "I'm Bundy." The nightmare had a name again. But the damage he left behind, the bodies, the survivors, the terror carved into a generation, could never be erased. When Ted Bundy was finally dragged back into custody in Florida, the world expected to see a broken fugitive. Instead, they saw a man who looked calm, almost amused, as though the chaos swirling around him was just another stage for his performance. What followed was not merely a trial, it was a spectacle. The Chi Omega murders and his subsequent crimes placed Bundy at the center of one of America's first televised trials. Cameras crowded the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. The public, both horrified and fascinated, tuned in as if it were some macabre theater. And Bundy, ever the narcissist, thrived on the attention. He represented himself in court, striding across the floor in a suit, questioning witnesses, objecting like a real attorney. To him, it wasn't about justice. It was about control, about proving that he could still manipulate the narrative. But his arrogance was impossible to hide. At times, Bundy smiled and winked at reporters. He proposed marriage to a woman, Carol Ann Boone, right there in the courtroom, exploiting a legal loophole that made it binding under Florida law. In the midst of testimony about broken skulls and strangled victims, Bundy turned the trial into a twisted performance of charm and defiance. The evidence, however, was overwhelming. Survivors and witnesses pointed to him. Bite marks on Lisa Levy's body matched Bundy's teeth with chilling precision. Forensic experts testified, leaving little doubt. Piece by piece, the mask he had worn for years, the polite law student, the helpful stranger, the misunderstood man, was ripped away. What stood before America was no longer Ted the neighbor, Ted the volunteer, Ted the law student. It was Ted the killer. Yet even as the walls closed in, Bundy clung to his illusion of control. He smirked when the verdict was read. Guilty. He smiled when the sentence was declared. Death. Perhaps he believed he could outlast the system, drag out appeals, keep the spotlight on himself. For years, he did just that. But the mask was gone. The world no longer saw him as clever, charming, or misunderstood. They saw him for what he truly was, a predator who had finally been caged. The years following Ted Bundy's conviction became a long, winding road of appeals, interviews, and last-minute stays of execution. He fought desperately to delay the inevitable, filing motions, manipulating lawyers, and feeding the media just enough details about unknown victims to buy himself more time. Each confession dangled like bait, designed to keep the spotlight on him. Bundy was no longer killing with his hands, he was killing with anticipation, forcing families of the missing to cling to faint hope, or to relive their grief with every headline. But time, at last, ran out. On the morning of January 24, 1989, in Florida State Prison, Bundy faced the end. Outside the prison gates, the atmosphere was nothing like the quiet solemnity of most executions. It was a carnival. Reporters swarmed, protesters clashed with cheering crowds, and vendors sold t-shirts emblazoned with slogans like "Burn, Bundy, burn." Hundreds gathered as if they were awaiting the finale of a grotesque show because, in many ways, that's exactly what Bundy's life had become. Inside, Bundy appeared pale, trembling, his once confident smile gone. After years of believing he could outmaneuver the system, The reality of the electric chair was unavoidable. Witnesses reported his eyes darting nervously as guards strapped him down. Leather restraints binding the very hands that once coaxed strangers into his car. For the first time, there was no stage left, no mask, no escape. At 7:16 a.m., the switch was thrown. The current surged through his body, and the man who had terrorized a nation was silenced. Outside, the waiting crowd erupted into cheers. Some wept with relief. Others celebrated with signs and chants. For them, it wasn't just justice, it was closure. Yet the moment was far from simple. To many, Bundy's death was justice served. A long-delayed answer to the screams of 30 women silenced too soon. But to others, the spectacle of his execution raised unsettling questions. Had Bundy become a monster, or had society turned him into a macabre celebrity? Did the cheering crowds reflect triumph, or did they reflect how deeply he had infected the American psyche? The cameras rolled, the cheers echoed, and Ted Bundy's body was carried away, leaving behind not peace, but an uneasy silence. When Ted Bundy's body left the Florida prison that cold January morning in 1989, many thought the nightmare was over, but Bundy's shadow didn't vanish with his death. It seeped into the very fabric of American culture. He was gone, yes, but the questions he left behind lingered, poisoning the air long after the execution chamber went silent. Bundy forced America to confront a truth it had long avoided. Monsters do not always wear masks. They can wear suits, smile politely, and shake your hand. They can sit beside you in class, or answer your call at a suicide hotline. His existence shattered the comforting illusion that evil was obvious, that it looked different from the rest of us. Instead, Bundy proved that evil could be hidden behind charm, intelligence, and familiarity. Law enforcement also changed forever. The FBI, shaken by Bundy's ability to slip through cracks and manipulate systems, developed its behavioral analysis unit, pioneering the field of criminal profiling. Investigators learned to see patterns, to understand psychology, to hunt killers not just with fingerprints, but with insight into their minds. Bundy's crimes became case studies, his interviews dissected in classrooms, his methods scrutinized in endless reports. In a twisted way, he became a teacher showing the world how vulnerable it had been. But perhaps the darkest legacy is the fascination. Books, documentaries, films. Bundy became a cultural obsession, a name whispered, not only in fear, but in morbid curiosity. Some saw him as a monster, others as a puzzle. Even now, decades later, his story continues to draw attention, as if people cannot look away from the abyss he represents. And maybe that is the real warning he leaves us with. That evil doesn't just kill, it captivates. It seduces, it lingers. So the question remains, could another Ted Bundy walk among us today? In an age of technology, surveillance, and DNA evidence, we like to believe such a predator could never hide again. But can we ever truly recognize the darkness behind a friendly smile? What do you think? Was Bundy a singular figure of horror, or just one face of a darkness that still surrounds us? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to know. If Ted Bundy could fool an entire nation once, how many others are still out there, waiting to be unmasked?